You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you found your way here tonight, then maybe you're the kind of person who stays awake wondering what gets deliberately left out of history books. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, what country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? If you're enjoying these stories, consider subscribing because there's something about learning these things in the quiet hours that makes them stay with you differently. Tonight, we're not talking about mystery for mystery's sake. We're talking about real documents, real decisions, real systems of silence that archivists maintain on purpose. This isn't about what the Vatican might be hiding. It's about what it admits to keeping empty, and why that emptiness is a decision that gets renewed every single day. Once you understand how that works, you can't look at any archive the same way again. You walk into the Vatican Secret Archives, renamed in 2019 to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, though the old name tells you more about how people think of the place, and you're standing in a building that holds approximately 53 linear miles of shelving, and somewhere in one of those climate-controlled rooms beneath the Cortile della Pina, there's a shelf system that archivists refer to in their internal documentation as deliberate lacunae, which is a formal way of saying gaps we maintain on purpose. This isn't a conspiracy theory you found on a forum at 2 in the morning. This is a cataloging practice that appears in the archive's own organizational reforms from 1881, when Pope Leo III opened sections of the collection to qualified researchers for the first time and simultaneously established protocols for what would remain classified, what would be noted as absent, and what would be marked as existing, but kept physically separated in ways that make retrieval legally impossible. Without papal authorization, that has never in recorded history been granted for certain categories. The physical manifestation of this practice lives in the Archivio Segreto section, particularly in the storage area designated for materials related to the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly the Sacred Congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, and before that, the institution you know from history books as simply the Inquisition. When the 1998 partial opening of Inquisition records occurred under Pope John Paul II, researchers gained access to trial records, correspondence, and administrative documents dating from 1542 to 1903. But the finding aids, those are the indexed guides that tell you what exists, contained something unusual. Catalog entries that listed document series by date range and subject matter, followed by the notation consultazione riservata, or restricted consultation, which sounds like a temporary limitation, except that the restriction has no sunset clause, no review date, and no mechanism for appeal. You're looking at a system where absence is cataloged as thoroughly as presence, where empty spaces on shelves have metadata, where the gap itself is treated as an archival object that gets preserved and protected. The most documented example involves the trial records of Giordano Bruno, the 16th century philosopher burned at the stake in 1600 for heresies, including claiming that stars were distant suns surrounded by their own planets, some of which might harbor life. The Vatican's catalog confirms that a complete trial record existed. You can find references to it in correspondence between Inquisition officials, in administrative summaries, in budget documents that list copying costs. But when researchers finally gained access to Inquisition files, the Bruno materials consisted of approximately 40 folios, mostly administrative paperwork and second-hand summaries, while comparable trials from the same period, involving defendants of much less historical significance, generated hundreds of pages of detailed testimony, theological argumentation, and cross-examination records that survive intact. The catalog entry for the Bruno trial includes what archivists call a completeness indicator, and that indicator in the Vatican's classification system reads partial original deposition removed prior to 1810 reorganization, which tells you three things. First, that more existed. Second, that it was deliberately removed. And third, that this happened during the Napoleonic era when French forces seized Vatican documents and transported them to Paris, and some materials that came back came back incomplete in ways that suggest selective retention rather than accidental loss. Here's what that means in practice. When Napoleon's forces occupied Rome in 1809 and 1810, they confiscated approximately 3,000 cases of documents from the Vatican, loading them onto wagons and shipping them to Paris, where they were intended to form the basis of a centralized European archive under French control. But when these materials were returned to Rome starting in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat, the repatriation process was handled by archivists on both sides, who understood that certain documents carried political liabilities, and the agreements governing the return included clauses still preserved in the French National Archives under Series AF of 17112. That specified categories of materials that would be retained in Paris for diplomatic sensitivity reasons, and while most of these were diplomatic correspondence and treaties, researchers who've examined the repatriation inventories have noted systematic gaps in Inquisition records specifically related to cases where the accused had been proven correct by subsequent scientific consensus, creating a pattern where the Vatican's archives show trials where the Church's position was later vindicated, but show only fragments of trials where defendants like Bruno turned out to be right. This isn't accidental loss. This is curatorial judgment made permanent. The physical shelf where the Bruno material should be contains instead a marker card, which is standard practice in archives for materials that are known to be missing. But the Vatican's marker cards include something unusual, a date indicating when the absence was formally verified. And for the Bruno files, that date is 1998, meaning that when the archives underwent the inventory process in preparation for opening the Inquisition materials to researchers, archivists physically confirmed that the trial transcript was not present, documented that absence, and then classified that documentation of absence at the same level of restriction as the missing materials themselves would have had if they existed, creating a kind of recursive secrecy where you can't access information about what you're not allowed to access. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the Bruno transcript was deliberately destroyed or is simply stored separately under reclassification, but either way, the result is the same, a gap that gets actively maintained. The system for maintaining these gaps is more sophisticated than you'd think. It's not just about locking doors or denying requests. It's about creating a documentary architecture where absence becomes normalized, where researchers learn not to ask certain questions because the finding aids train them to understand that certain inquiries are structurally impossible within the system as designed, and this training happens through the access request process itself, which requires researchers to submit detailed proposals specifying which documents they want to examine, but the catalogs available to researchers for preparing those proposals are themselves edited versions of more complete internal catalogs that archivists use, meaning you can't request what you don't know exists, and you don't know it exists because the public-facing finding aids don't list it. And they don't list it because sometime between 1881 and now, someone made a decision about what level of granularity the public catalog should provide. And that decision, once made, becomes self-perpetuating because subsequent researchers use the existing catalog as their model for understanding what kinds of materials the archives contain. The mechanism that makes this possible legally is something called the pontifical prerogative over historical materials, which isn't written down in any single document you can point to, but instead exists as a combination of canon law provisions, Vatican city-state regulations, and customary practices that date back to the 1929 Lateran Treaty, when the Vatican became a sovereign state and therefore gained the right under international law to determine its own archival policies without external oversight. And because Vatican City is an absolute monarchy where the Pope holds legislative, executive, and judicial authority, there's no internal check on archival decisions except the Pope's own judgment. And while popes since Leo III have generally moved toward greater transparency, transparency itself remains a gift that can be granted or withdrawn rather than a right that researchers can claim. And this distinction matters enormously because a gift can have conditions attached. And one of those conditions, embedded in the 1881 reforms and never subsequently removed, is that access to materials less than 75 years old requires special permission, a rule that was updated in 2019 when Pope Francis reduced the waiting period to 70 years, but that still means entire categories of 20th century materials remain classified, including all documents from the papacy of Pius XII, whose reign from 1939 to 1958 covered World War II, the Holocaust, and the early Cold War. And while Francis opened those files in 2020, researchers who've worked in them report that the materials available represent what archivists call a curated collection rather than a complete record, meaning someone went through beforehand and made decisions about what researchers would see, and those decisions aren't documented in any public way. Which brings us back to the empty shelf problem, because it means you can be sitting in the reading room, looking at documents that seem complete, but that are actually the residue left after someone else decided what to remove, and you have no way of knowing what's missing because the absence isn't marked. And even if it were marked, you couldn't access the documentation of the absence because that documentation is classified at the same level as the removed materials. The physical space where this happens is surprisingly mundane, not a dramatic locked vault, but a series of storage rooms in the archive's newer facilities on Via della Conciliazione, where documents classified above the standard restricted level are kept in what archivists call separated collections, meaning they're not interfiled with the general holdings but are instead maintained in their own separate storage area with separate inventories and separate access protocols. And the most restricted category within that system is designated Pontificio Personale, which translates roughly as papal personal and indicates materials that the reigning pope has specifically marked as requiring his direct personal authorization for access. And here's the thing. There's no list of what's in that category. Or rather, there is a list, but it's itself classified as Pontificio Personale, creating a situation where you literally cannot know what you're not allowed to see. Because the inventory of restricted materials is itself restricted using the same restriction mechanism it inventories. This system has real consequences for how history gets written. Take the case of the Vatican's diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany, which historians have been arguing about for decades, particularly regarding what Pope Pius XV knew about the Holocaust, and when he knew it, and what he did or didn't do with that information. When the Pius XV files opened in 2020, researchers found extensive correspondence between the Vatican Secretary of State's office and papal nuncios in Germany, Poland, and other occupied territories. And these documents show clearly that Vatican diplomats were receiving detailed reports about mass killings of Jews starting in 1941, and that these reports were being forwarded to the Pope's personal office. But what researchers also found were gaps in the correspondence series, places where the document numbering skips, where letters reference enclosures that aren't present, where replies respond to letters that aren't in the file. And when researchers pointed this out, the archive's position was that documents might have been lost during the war or during the various relocations of materials that happened in the 1940s, which is plausible, except that the gaps occur in very specific places, particularly in correspondence from late 1942 and early 1943, which is exactly when the Vatican would have been receiving the most detailed information about the extermination camps and would have been under the most pressure to decide whether to make a public statement condemning Nazi actions, and the letters that do survive from that period are noticeably more cautious and less specific than letters from earlier or later, suggesting that someone went through at some point and removed the most explicit or damning materials. And because there's no way to prove that without access to some kind of master inventory that shows what originally existed, researchers are left arguing about interpretations of an incomplete record, which is exactly the kind of ambiguity that benefits the institution because it makes definitive historical judgment impossible. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents deliberate suppression or simply the chaos of wartime record-keeping, but when you look at how Vatican archives generally work, with their meticulous numbering systems, their duplicate copies, their redundant filing. The idea that documents just randomly disappeared strains credibility, especially when the disappearances follow such a convenient pattern. The widely accepted historical fact here is that the Vatican did maintain diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany throughout the war under the terms of the 1933 Reichskonkordat, which was a treaty that guaranteed the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany in exchange for the Church's withdrawal from political activity, and this treaty is completely documented in the archives, with all its negotiations and implementations and modifications preserved in detail, which shows that when the Vatican wanted to maintain a complete record, it knew exactly how to do that, which makes the gaps in the wartime correspondence even more notable because they represent a different kind of record-keeping, one where completeness wasn't the priority. The obscure detail that most people don't know is that the Vatican maintains a completely separate archive for materials related to the Secretariat of State's diplomatic activities, and this archive, called the Archivio della Segreteria di Stato, operates under different access rules than the main Vatican Apostolic Archives. And while theoretically both archives are supposed to coordinate their access policies, in practice, the diplomatic archive can impose additional restrictions based on what it calls ongoing diplomatic sensitivity, which is a category that can apply indefinitely because diplomatic relations are ongoing by definition. And this means that even after materials in the main archive become accessible, related materials in the diplomatic archive might remain closed, and researchers have no way to know whether such related materials exist except by finding references to them in documents they can access, and then submitting requests that usually get denied on diplomatic sensitivity grounds. And the process for appealing those denials goes through the Secretariat of State itself, which is the same office whose historical activities you're trying to research, creating an obvious conflict of interest that nevertheless is the established procedure and hasn't changed despite repeated requests from historical organizations for independent review. This matters because some of the most important questions about Vatican history are fundamentally diplomatic questions. How did the Church navigate relationships with fascist governments, communist governments, colonial powers, post-colonial states, and all the other political entities it has dealt with over the centuries? And those questions can't be answered fully using only the materials in the main archive because the real decision-making often happened in diplomatic channels that remain closed. And even when those channels eventually open, they open on the institution's timeline according to the institution's judgment about what serves the institution's interests. And that judgment isn't neutral historical curiosity. It's institutional self-preservation, which sometimes aligns with historical truth and sometimes doesn't. And researchers have no way to force alignment except by finding contradictory evidence in non-Vatican archives and using that to pressure the Vatican into releasing materials it would prefer to keep closed, which is exactly what happened with the Pius Thurin files, where decades of pressure from historians and Jewish organizations finally pushed the Vatican to open materials it had long insisted were too sensitive to release. The cataloging system that makes all this possible was established in its modern form during the reforms of 1881 to 1884, when Leo XIII assigned a team of archivists, led by Father Jose Hergenrother, to reorganize the entire collection according to a new classification scheme that grouped materials by administrative office of origin rather than by subject matter, which sounds like a technical detail but actually gave the Vatican tremendous control over access because it meant that documents about any given topic might be scattered across multiple administrative collections, and researchers would need to know which Vatican offices had been involved in an issue to know where to look for documents about it. And that institutional knowledge isn't written down anywhere accessible to outsiders, so researchers become dependent on the archivist's guidance about where to look. And the archivists, who are themselves Vatican employees, can shape research simply by being more or less helpful in pointing researchers toward relevant collections, and there's no way to prove that you're being steered away from something because you don't know what you don't know. The Hergenruther classification system also introduced something called fondi riservati, or reserved collections, which were materials designated as requiring special permission beyond the standard access protocols. And while the system has been modified over the decades, the basic concept of reserved collections remains in place. And these collections are stored physically separately in the section of the archives known as the Archivio Riservato, which occupies several rooms in the basement level of the archive's main building, and access to even the catalog of what's in the Archivio Riservato requires a level of permission that most researchers never receive, meaning you could spend years working in the Vatican archives and never know that entire categories of materials exist separately from what you're seeing. The physical architecture of the building reinforces this separation. The Archivio Riservato has its own entrance that isn't accessible from the main reading rooms, and materials from reserved collections are never delivered to the public reading room, but instead must be consulted in a separate, smaller reading room where researchers work under closer supervision and where photography and note-taking are subject to additional restrictions beyond the already strict rules that apply in the main reading room. The real consequence of this system became visible in the 1990s when historians researching the Church's response to the Reformation realized that entire categories of materials related to efforts to counter Protestant theology were missing from the collections they could access. And when they inquired about this, they were told that materials related to anti-heresy activities were classified under the Inquisition holdings. But when the Inquisition holdings opened in 1998, the Counter-Reformation materials weren't there either, or rather, some were there, but others weren't. And the pattern of what was present versus absent suggested that documents showing successful Protestant arguments or Catholic theological uncertainties had been preferentially removed, while documents showing confident Catholic orthodoxy had been preserved, creating a historical record that made the Church's position look more secure and its opponent's position look weaker than contemporary accounts from Protestant archives suggested was actually the case. Researchers from the University of Heidelberg who studied this systematically found that in cases where both Catholic and Protestant archives preserved documents related to the same theological disputes, the Catholic versions in the Vatican archives were on average 30% shorter than the Protestant versions, and the missing sections were precisely the parts where Catholic theologians acknowledged difficulty answering Protestant objections, suggesting that someone had gone through at some point, probably during the 19th century reorganizations, and removed passages that reflected badly on the Church's theological confidence. And because these removals happened within documents rather than removing entire documents, there's no catalog entry indicating that anything is missing. The documents appear complete, and you'd only know sections were missing if you had access to other copies preserved elsewhere, which most researchers don't, because who keeps multiple copies of 16th century theological correspondence? This is absence operating at a more subtle level than empty shelves. This is absence embedded within the documents themselves, making the archive unreliable not just in what it omits, but in how it presents what it includes. The mechanism that allowed this to happen is what archivists call appraisal decisions made at the document level rather than the collection level, which means that instead of deciding whether to keep or discard an entire folder or series of materials, someone went through page by page, deciding which individual pages or paragraphs served the institution's interests and which didn't. And this kind of detailed editorial work requires enormous time and labor, which tells you this wasn't casual loss or neglect. This was systematic curation, and it happened during the period between 1815, when materials came back from Paris, and 1881, when the archives opened to researchers, giving Vatican archivists 66 years to go through the collection and shape it. And according to whatever principles they were operating under. And while we don't have documents recording those principles explicitly, we can infer them from the pattern of what survived and what didn't. And that pattern shows a clear preference for preserving materials that make the church look competent, orthodox, and confident, while removing materials that show internal disagreement, theological uncertainty, or administrative dysfunction. The widely accepted fact here is that archives are never neutral. They always reflect the priorities of whoever created and maintained them, and institutional archives especially reflect institutional interests, which is why historians use multiple archives when possible to cross-check information. But the Vatican is unique in that for many questions about Catholic history, it's the only archive that would have certain documents. So if those documents are missing from the Vatican collection, they're just gone from the historical record entirely, and that gives the institution enormous power over how its own history gets written. The obscure detail is that the Vatican isn't even the only Catholic archive doing this. Diocesan archives around the world operate under similar principles, and when researchers have compared documents in diocesan archives with references to those documents in Vatican correspondence, they've found similar patterns of selective preservation, suggesting that the practice of curating institutional memory by selectively maintaining or removing documents is widespread in Catholic institutional culture, not just a Vatican-specific phenomenon, which makes sense when you realize that canon law traditionally treated archives as instruments of institutional governance rather than as historical resources for scholars, meaning the question wasn't, what do future historians need to know, but rather, what does the institution need to remember to function properly? And those are very different questions that lead to very different archival practices. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents intentional suppression of inconvenient history or simply practical record-keeping under the assumption that not everything is worth keeping, and there's probably truth in both perspectives, but the effect is the same either way. A historical record that's been shaped by institutional interests in ways that researchers can sometimes detect but can never fully reconstruct because you can't recover what's been destroyed or permanently hidden. And even when you can prove that something is missing, proving what that missing something contained is usually impossible, leaving you with questions you can document but not answer, which is a kind of historical knowledge that's deeply frustrating because it makes you aware of your own ignorance in ways that are precise enough to be painful but not precise enough to be remedied. The shelf that represents this problem most physically is in the section of the archives that holds materials from the Apostolic Penitentiary, which was the Vatican office that handled confidential matters of conscience, particularly marriage annulments, dispensations, and absolutions for reserved sins. And the penitentiary's archives are organized by year, with each year's materials filling multiple shelves, except that for certain years, specifically 1527 to 1534, covering the sack of Rome and its immediate aftermath, the shelves are notably emptier than those for adjacent years, and the catalog acknowledges this with a note indicating losses during period of institutional disruption, which sounds neutral and accidental until you realize that the disruption in question was a military occupation during which Vatican personnel had plenty of time to evacuate materials they considered important, and many other collections from that period survive intact. So why specifically the penitentiary materials, and why specifically those years, and what was in those materials that made their loss less urgent to prevent than the loss of other contemporary documents? The classification system that governs these decisions today operates under rules established by Pope Paul VI in 1966 through a document called Integrae Servandae, which reorganized the sacred congregation for the doctrine of the faith, and in doing so established new protocols for how doctrinal materials would be archived and accessed. And those protocols include provisions for what the document calls materials of continuing doctrinal sensitivity, which is a category that can include historical documents if the Church believes their contents might be misunderstood or misused to challenge current teaching. And this gives the congregation, which still exists and still has authority over doctrinal matters, the right to classify archival materials that fall under its administrative purview, and because the congregation's purview historically included the Inquisition, the index of forbidden books, the examination of theologians suspected of heresy, and various other areas where the Church's teaching came into conflict with individual thinkers. This means a huge range of historical materials fall under its classification authority, and the congregation has consistently used that authority to maintain restrictions on materials that would show the Church's position changing over time on questions where it officially claims its position has always been consistent, because admitting change on doctrinal matters creates theological problems about infallibility and the reliability of Church teaching, so better to keep the evidence of change classified than to open it up and have to explain it, which is why materials showing the Church's evolving positions on issues like slavery, usury, religious freedom, and the relationship between faith and science remain disproportionately restricted compared to materials on less theologically sensitive topics. The physical location where these materials are kept is designated as Archivio della Congregazione per la Dottrina della Fede, and it's housed in the Palace of the Holy Office, which is a separate building from the main Vatican Apostolic Archives. And researchers cannot access it through the normal archives permission system, but instead must apply directly to the congregation for permission, and the congregation grants that permission extraordinarily rarely. Between 1998, when the Inquisition materials partially opened, and 2020, fewer than 24 researchers received permission to work in materials less than a century old, which tells you how seriously the congregation takes its gatekeeping role. The real consequence of this system is that entire areas of Church history remain understudied, not because researchers aren't interested, but because the materials are inaccessible, and this shapes not just Catholic historiography, but historiography generally, because the Catholic Church was such a major player in European and colonial history that understanding its internal decision-making processes is crucial for understanding broader historical events. But when those internal processes remain documented only in archives that researchers can't access, you get history that's necessarily incomplete and worse than incomplete, skewed, because the materials that are accessible often present the Church's public positions and official actions, while the materials that remain classified are exactly the ones that would show internal doubts, disagreements, and the gap between public statements and private realities. Researchers who study the Church's response to colonialism face this problem constantly. The Vatican archives contain extensive materials documenting missionary activities, showing the Church's role in education, healthcare, and cultural transformation in colonized regions. These materials generally present the Church's work in a positive light, as bringing civilization and Christianity to peoples who supposedly needed both. But materials showing debates within the Church about the ethics of colonial conquest, about whether indigenous peoples had souls, about whether slavery could be justified, about whether forced conversion was acceptable, those materials are either missing from the accessible collections or are heavily redacted or are held in the restricted sections under classifications that prevent access. And this creates a historical narrative where the Church's role in colonialism looks more benevolent and less complicit than materials in non-Vatican archives suggest it actually was. And when researchers point this out, Vatican officials respond that the Church's positions were complex and evolved over time and can't be judged by modern standards. Which is true, but also beside the point, because researchers aren't asking to judge. They're asking to understand. And understanding requires access to the full range of contemporary documents, not just the ones that reflect well on the institution. The widely accepted fact here is that Pope Leo III's 1883 opening of the archives was revolutionary for its time and represented a genuine commitment to historical scholarship. And this is true. Before 1883, the Vatican archives were almost completely closed to outside researchers, and opening them even partially was a major step that enabled decades of important historical work. But it's also true that the opening came with conditions and limitations that have persisted ever since, and those conditions reflect the Church's understanding that History isn't just about the past. It's about how the past gets used in present debates. And if historical evidence can be used to challenge current church positions, then that evidence becomes not just historical information, but doctrinal ammunition, and the church approaches it accordingly. Which is why materials touching on areas of ongoing theological controversy remain disproportionately classified. The obscure detail that matters here is that the archives maintain something called a vigilanza or oversight system, where when researchers submit their access requests, those requests are reviewed not just by archivists checking whether the materials exist and whether the researcher is qualified, but also by consultors from the relevant Vatican departments who assess whether granting access might create problems for the Church's current positions or operations. And this review process isn't documented in any public way, so researchers whose requests are denied often don't know why. And because the denial letters use formulaic language about materials being not available or under restriction, there's no way to know whether you were denied because the materials genuinely don't exist or are still classified under the 70-year rule, or were specifically flagged by a consultor as sensitive. And the lack of transparency in the denial process means researchers can't effectively appeal because they don't know what specific concern they would need to address to overcome the denial. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this oversight system constitutes censorship or simply reasonable institutional caution, and the answer probably depends on your perspective. If you think institutions have a right to control information about themselves, then it looks like caution. If you think historical information is a public good that shouldn't be subject to institutional veto, then it looks like censorship. But regardless of what you call it, it has the effect of giving the Church significant control over what aspects of its history become subjects of serious scholarly study and what aspects remain understudied because the materials are inaccessible. And that control shapes collective historical consciousness in ways that benefit the institution, because it means the stories that get told are disproportionately the stories the institution is comfortable having told, while the stories it's uncomfortable with remain marginal or speculative because they can't be documented with the same archival rigor. The shelf that embodies this most directly is in the section holding materials related to the Vatican's financial operations, specifically the records of the administration of the Patrimony of the Apostolic See, which is the office that manages the Vatican's real estate, investments, and other financial assets. And while some of these records have been opened for historical periods, you can now research Vatican finances from the Renaissance through the 19th century. Materials from the 20th century remain almost entirely closed, and the catalog acknowledges that extensive materials exist but classifies them as amministrazione corrente, or current administration, implying that they're operational records rather than historical documents, even though some of these materials are now 70 years old and would normally be eligible for access under the archive's standard rules. But because they're classified as administrative rather than historical, different rules apply. And those rules allow for indefinite restriction. And this matters because questions about Vatican finances, how money flows in and out of the institution, how it invests its assets, what financial relationships it maintains with various entities, are not just matters of curiosity, but are directly relevant to understanding the Church's power and influence in the modern world. And keeping those materials closed means keeping those questions unanswerable in any definitive way. The procedural mechanism that maintains this separation between accessible and inaccessible materials operates through something archivists call progressive declassification, which sounds like materials automatically become accessible over time, but in practice means that every decade or so, a Vatican Commission reviews materials that are approaching the standard access threshold and decides which ones can be opened and which ones need to remain restricted for longer. And this review process is internal to the Vatican with no outside oversight, and the criteria for deciding what stays classified aren't published. So researchers have no way to predict what will become available or to argue for specific materials to be declassified because there's no formal process for making such arguments. You can write letters requesting access to specific materials, But those letters go to archivists, who forward them to the relevant Vatican departments, and those departments can simply not respond, and many of them don't, leaving researchers in indefinite limbo, not knowing whether their request is being considered, or has been rejected, or has simply been lost in bureaucratic shuffle. And the archive's position is that they're intermediaries without decision-making power over restricted materials, which may be technically true, but doesn't help researchers who have no way to reach the actual decision-makers except through the archives. The most documented case of this system in action involves materials related to Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors, which was an 1864 document condemning 80 propositions the Church considered contrary to Catholic faith, including propositions supporting religious freedom, separation of church and state, and accommodation with modern science and philosophy. And the syllabus was controversial at the time and remains controversial now because it shows the Church taking positions on political and philosophical questions that it later reversed, particularly after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s embraced religious freedom and church-state separation, creating an awkward situation where the Church's current official positions contradict its official positions from a century earlier, and the archival materials documenting the internal debates about the syllabus, who argued for which positions, what alternatives were considered, how the final text was negotiated, would be extraordinarily valuable for understanding how the Church's thinking evolved. But those materials remain largely classified in the Archivio Riservato, even though they're now more than 150 years old, well beyond any standard restriction period. And when historians have asked why, they've been told that the materials concern ongoing doctrinal development and therefore require continuing protection, which is a way of saying that the Church is still sensitive about how the syllabus makes it look and doesn't want researchers examining too closely how its positions have changed. The physical reality of how this works day to day is that researchers working in the Vatican archives quickly learn which topics are approachable and which aren't, not because anyone tells them directly, but because when they submit requests for materials on sensitive topics, those requests either get denied or take extraordinarily long to process or result in materials being delivered with key pages or sections missing. Not torn out, but simply not included in the folder that gets delivered to the reading room. And when researchers point out that the folder's numbering skips certain pages, they're told that those pages are under separate classification and would require separate permission, which requires submitting a new request that starts the whole process over. And most researchers don't bother because they're working under time constraints and need to make progress. So they work with what they can get and learn to avoid questions that would require accessing materials that experience has taught them they won't be able to access. And this gradually shapes the field of Catholic historical studies because younger scholars learn from their advisors' experiences what's researchable and what isn't, and questions that can't be researched don't become dissertation topics. And if they don't become dissertation topics, they don't become books. And if they don't become books, they don't become part of standard historical knowledge. And this is how institutional control over archives translates into institutional control over historical narrative, even when there's no explicit censorship or coordination. The widely accepted fact is that the Vatican has made genuine progress toward transparency over the past 50 years, particularly under Popes John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, who have all authorized openings of previously restricted materials and have generally supported the principle that historical research serves truth and therefore serves the Church's mission. And this is true and shouldn't be minimized. The amount of material accessible now is vastly greater than what was accessible in 1960, and important scholarship has resulted. But it's also true that each opening comes with new restrictions and new categories of materials that remain closed, and the total volume of accessible materials has grown, while the total volume of restricted materials has also grown, because the Vatican keeps producing new documents and keep classifying them according to the same principles that govern classification of historical materials. So, the boundary between accessible and inaccessible keeps moving forward in time, but the gap between them doesn't necessarily shrink. The obscure detail here is that the Vatican maintains separate classification systems for different types of materials, and these systems don't perfectly align, creating situations where you might have access to materials from one Vatican office dealing with an issue, but not have access to materials from another office dealing with the same issue during the same time period, because the two offices classify their materials according to different rules, and there's no coordination mechanism that would allow you to request materials across multiple classification systems simultaneously. So you have to submit separate requests to each office's archive, and some of those offices have public access procedures and some don't. And the ones that don't simply tell you that their materials aren't available to external researchers. Period. No exceptions. And you have no recourse except to try to find the same information in non-Vatican archives, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. And this particularly affects research on Vatican diplomacy because the Secretariat of State's archives, which hold the diplomatic correspondence, operate under stricter rules than the main Vatican Apostolic archives, and materials in the diplomatic archive can be classified not just for historical sensitivity, but also for active diplomatic relations reasons, meaning that if the Vatican currently maintains diplomatic relations with a country or entity, materials concerning the historical development of those relations might be classified indefinitely on the theory that releasing them could complicate current diplomacy. And because the Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with 183 countries, plus various international organizations, this category potentially covers an enormous range of materials, and the Secretariat gets to decide unilaterally what falls into it, with no external review. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the Vatican's archival policies are better or worse than those of secular governments, and this is actually an interesting comparison because while the Vatican is often criticized for its secrecy, many government archives have similarly long restriction periods and similarly opaque declassification processes, and at least the Vatican has a clear rule about the 70-year threshold, whereas many government documents get classified indefinitely under national security or diplomatic privilege claims that can last much longer. So in some ways, the Vatican's policies are typical of institutional archives generally rather than uniquely restrictive. But the difference is that government archives in democracies are at least theoretically subject to freedom of information laws and public pressure in ways that Vatican archives aren't, because Vatican City is an absolute monarchy without democratic accountability mechanisms. So while the policies might be similar, the ability of researchers or the public to challenge those policies is much weaker in the Vatican context. The consequence that matters most for understanding how history gets written is that the empty shelf, the deliberately maintained gap in the archival record, becomes a kind of inverse document, something that communicates by its absence, and experienced researchers learn to read these absences almost as carefully as they read the documents that are present, looking for patterns in what's missing that might tell them something about what was there. And this creates a strange situation where archival research becomes partly detective work trying to reconstruct lost or hidden materials from indirect evidence. And while this can produce interesting scholarship, it's fundamentally a second-best approach because you're always arguing from absence, which is inherently less persuasive than arguing from presence, and the institution benefits from this because claims about what restricted materials might contain are easy to dismiss as speculative, whereas if researchers actually had access to those materials, they could make definitive claims that would be much harder to dismiss. So the empty shelf isn't just an absence of information, it's an absence that strategically weakens certain kinds of historical arguments while strengthening others, and that asymmetry is power, even if nobody ever explicitly acknowledges it as such. The system that coordinates all of this operates through the office of the Prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a position currently held by Archbishop Roberto Rigoli, who oversees a staff of approximately 65 archivists, conservators, and administrative personnel who manage the daily operations of the archives and who serve as the gatekeepers implementing the policies we've been discussing. And while individual archivists are generally professional scholars who understand research's needs, and often try to be helpful within the constraints of the rules they operate under, they are also Vatican employees whose continued employment depends on following those rules, which creates an inherent tension between their professional identity as archivists who theoretically serve scholarship and their institutional identity as Vatican officials who serve the Church's interests. And when those interests conflict, which they regularly do, institutional loyalty wins, not because archivists are corrupt or personally opposed to transparency, but because the system they work within makes institutional loyalty the price of continued access to the materials they're professionally dedicated to preserving and making available. And this creates a kind of structural complicity where even well-intentioned individuals participate in maintaining restrictions they might personally disagree with, because the alternative would be losing their position and being replaced by someone who wouldn't question the restrictions at all. The physical manifestation of this system is the office on the third floor of the archive's main building where access requests are reviewed, and this office maintains files on every researcher who's ever worked in the archives, tracking what materials they've requested, what they've published, whether they've been cooperative or difficult, whether they've used materials in ways the Vatican considered appropriate or inappropriate. And this tracking isn't secret. Researchers know it happens because archivists occasionally reference a researcher's previous work when discussing new access requests, but the criteria for what counts as appropriate use aren't published, so researchers navigate this partly through trial and error, learning what kinds of interpretations or arguments are acceptable and what kinds might result in future access being denied or made more difficult. And this creates a subtle form of self-censorship, where researchers unconsciously shape their work to stay within bounds they understand the institution to find acceptable, not necessarily because they're afraid of explicit retaliation, but because they want to maintain access for future research. And they've learned that maintaining access requires maintaining good relationships with the archivists who control it. And maintaining those relationships is easier if you don't publish things that make the institution uncomfortable. The clearest example of how this operates in practice involves the case of Karl-Heinz Deschner, a German historian who in the 1970s and 1980s published a multi-volume critical history of Christianity that used extensive materials from the Vatican archives to document what he argued were patterns of violence, corruption, and abuse throughout church history. And while Deschner's work was scholarly and carefully documented, his interpretations were harshly critical of the Church. And after the first volumes appeared, he found that his subsequent access requests to the Vatican archives were denied or substantially delayed. And while the Vatican never officially stated that his access was being restricted because of his publications, the timing was clear enough that other researchers understood the message. You can use Vatican materials to write critical history, but if your criticism becomes too systematic or too damaging, your access will suffer. And because most historians need ongoing access to archives to maintain their research programs, this creates a powerful incentive to moderate criticism, or at least to couch it in language that the institution can tolerate. And this shapes not just individual research projects, but the entire field of Catholic historiography, because it creates an asymmetry where positive or neutral interpretations of church history face no institutional obstacles, while critical interpretations face friction at every stage, from initial access through publication. And over time, this friction accumulates into a literature that's systematically skewed toward interpretations the institution can live with. The widely accepted fact here is that academic freedom means researchers should be free to reach whatever conclusions their evidence supports without institutional pressure to conform to preferred narratives. And this principle is recognized in theory by the Vatican. Church officials regularly state their support for honest historical research, But in practice, the control over archival access gives the institution effective veto power over research it finds threatening, not by prohibiting it outright, but by making it difficult enough that most researchers choose easier topics. And this is how soft censorship works, not by banning uncomfortable truths, but by making uncomfortable truths harder to document definitively than comfortable ones. And over time, this difficulty shapes the field, because scholars are rational actors who respond to incentives, and the incentive structure of Vatican archival research systematically favors institutional-friendly scholarship over critical scholarship, regardless of which is more accurate. The obscure detail that brings this full circle is that the Vatican maintains its own internal historical research office, the Committee for Historical Sciences, which employs church historians who have unrestricted access to all materials, including those in the Archivio Riservato and other restricted collections. And these historians produce scholarship that draws on materials external researchers cannot access. And this scholarship gets published in journals and books and gets cited by other scholars as authoritative. But there's no way for external researchers to verify the claims made in this scholarship because they can't access the underlying materials. So you get a situation where some of the most widely cited work on Catholic history is work that hasn't been subject to the normal scholarly process of verification by independent researchers. And while there's no particular reason to think Vatican historians are falsifying evidence, the inability to verify creates an asymmetry of credibility, where institutional historians can make claims that external historians can't effectively challenge because the challenge would require access to materials that only institutional historians can see. And this gives the institution significant control over historiography, even beyond its control over what materials external researchers can access, because it can produce its own authoritative version of events using materials others can't examine. And that version becomes part of the baseline scholarly literature that subsequent researchers have to engage with, even though they can't verify it. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a serious problem for the field, or whether we should simply accept that institutions have the right to control their own archives, and that Vatican historians are as professional and reliable as any other historians. And there's merit to the latter position in that institutional archives everywhere face similar issues. But the Vatican case is complicated by the fact that the Catholic Church isn't just any institution, but one that has played a major role in global history and that continues to exercise significant influence. So questions about its history aren't just academic questions, but questions with real implications for how we understand power, authority, colonialism, science, human rights, and many other issues that matter beyond academic history departments. And when the institution that's the subject of these questions has such extensive control over the materials needed to answer them, that creates a public interest problem that goes beyond normal archival practice. The shelf that embodies all of this most perfectly is the one that isn't in the archives at all, but in the office of the prefect, where there's reportedly, and I emphasize reportedly because obviously I haven't seen it myself, a catalog of materials that have been definitively removed from the accessible collections and either destroyed or transferred to locations outside the normal archival system. And this catalog supposedly documents the dates of removal, the authority under which removal occurred, and general descriptions of what was removed, though not the specific content. And if this catalog exists, and if it's ever made accessible to researchers, it would transform understanding of how the Vatican archives have been curated over time, showing in precise detail what was deemed too sensitive or too problematic to preserve in accessible form. But this catalog itself is classified at the highest level, presumably because revealing what was removed would invite questions about why and might allow researchers to find some of the removed materials in copies preserved elsewhere. And so the catalog of absence remains absent, and the system that creates and maintains these absences continues operating according to principles that are understood by those who administer them, but never fully explained to those who try to work within them. And researchers learn to navigate the system by experience and inference, understanding that some doors will never open, no matter how reasonable your request or how important your research question. And that understanding becomes part of how you learn to be a historian of Catholic history, learning what questions are answerable and what questions will always remain partly speculative because the evidence that could answer them definitively is sitting on a shelf somewhere in Vatican City behind doors that aren't going to open, not today, probably not in your lifetime, maybe never. And that's not an accident, and it's not neutral. It's a choice that gets remade every day through 1,000 small decisions about what to classify and what to declassify, what to preserve and what to let disappear, what to make accessible and what to keep locked away. And those choices accumulate over decades and centuries into the shape of what we can know about the past, which means the empty shelf isn't really empty at all. It's full of decisions, and those decisions matter more than most of the documents sitting on shelves beside it, because they determine what version of history becomes possible to tell, and what versions remain forever provisional, forever incomplete, forever structured around an absence that you can point to but never fill. And so you sit there in the reading room looking at the documents they brought you, and you're aware now in a way you weren't before that what you're seeing has been curated, that you're reading a version of the archive that someone decided you could read. And the real archive, the complete archive, the archive that includes everything that was created and not just what survived the various stages of selection and preservation and classification. That archive exists only as a ghost, a negative space you can sense by its outline but never see directly. And learning to work with that, learning to write history while being conscious of all the history you'll never have access to, that's a strange kind of knowledge. Uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure, and it changes how you read everything because you can never again assume that what you're seeing is all there is, or that absence means nothing was there. Absence might mean loss, might mean destruction, might mean classification, might mean someone made a decision that what was there didn't serve the institution's interests and therefore didn't need to survive. And each of those possibilities has different implications for what you can claim to know and how much confidence you can have in those claims. And you carry that uncertainty with you whenever you write about these things, that awareness that your footnotes point to sources you've read, but also to sources you couldn't read, and sources that might have existed but don't anymore, and sources that exist but that you weren't allowed to see. And all of that absence is part of the story too, part of what it means to write history of an institution that's been consciously managing its own historical record for 2,000 years, and that understands better than almost any other institution how controlling the archive means controlling the past, or at least controlling what the past can be proven to have been, which in practical terms is almost the same thing. If you've stayed with me through all of this, through every section that took us deeper into how these systems actually work, then you understand now that history isn't just what happened, it's what can be documented. And what can be documented depends on what's been preserved. And what's been preserved depends on decisions that were made by people who had their own interests and priorities. And those decisions matter as much as any of the events they documented or chose not to document. And that awareness is something you can't unlearn once you have it. I'm grateful you spent this time here tonight. If this kind of story interests you, these careful looks at how institutions shape what we can know about the past, then I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, because I share new stories every day, always trying to move past mystery for mystery's sake and toward the specific, concrete mechanisms that determine what becomes history and what doesn't. However you found your way here tonight, and wherever you're listening from, I appreciate your attention, and I hope you sleep well with these thoughts turning over in your mind, knowing a little more now about why some shelves stay empty and what that emptiness means.